I'm Ruby Margaret Hazen. I was born January 16th, 1921 in Portland, Oregon. We lived at Fairvale, which was a suburb 7 miles away. My mother had a bad cold and went into labor prematurely. My father was a bus driver, and he was out at Hillsborough, so they called him, and his car was a 1920 Winton sedan, and he had a dual exhaust which he could put halfway to make sound like a siren, which he did. Came dashing home to get Mother, and then they went over Council Crest Hill to Portland, the shortest route to the hospital. And on the way, I decided to arrive. When we arrived at the hospital, my father went in and told them we had a baby, and they said, "Oh, we've delivered a lot of babies," and he said, "But we already have a baby," and they got excited. And because the car didn't have windows like we know today, they had isinglass curtains which rolled down from the roof to the body. And there was snow on the ground, and the cold wind was blowing. And Mother said she'd never been so cold in her life. And by the time they got me to the hospital, my tips of my toes and fingers were turned black, and my face was rough, red and wrinkled. And they had no incubators at that time, so they kept me in hot water bottles. When they sent me home from the hospital, my mother had to keep me in hot water bottles for a month. Then my grandfather, Fred Ruff built 3 houses on the east end of Beaverton, Oregon. And it was the first road that went from the Bertha Beaverton Highway and Canyon Road, which were both roads which went from Portland to Beaverton. Grandpa lived in the first house, and Grandma, and Uncle Jack and Aunt Iva lived in the second house, and we lived in the third house. And Grandma was doing some canning, so I was at the table coloring, and I was 3, and Mother said, "I'm gonna go help Grandma can. I'll leave the door ajar, so if you need anything, you can come get me." And I colored away, and the next thing, 2 big dogs came through the door. They were white with black spots. And they went over and sniffed the drain board. Then they came back and sniffed the table and me, and turned around and went back out the door. Well, they were so big they scared me. And I went running to my mama, and when they came back to make sure everything in the house was okay, my aunt said, "Those must be Mr. So-and-so's dogs down the street. He got a new breed called Dalmatian." So that was a brand new breed in 1921. Then at about 4 years, we moved in with Grandma and Grandpa Strife, who lived at Fairvale, which was, well, already said it was 7 miles from Portland, on Shattuck Road, which was a crossroad to the Bertha Beaverton Highway. They also at that time had an electric train that went from Portland to Hillsborough, and at Shattuck Road and the railroad track they had Shattuck Station. Grandpa's property ran just from the next farm up. He had almost 100 acres that faced Shattuck Road and went down to Vermont Street. And we had a creek it was kind of on a hill, and he had a creek at the bottom of the hill. Grandma and Grandpa Strive's house was large. They had 7 children, and they built this house with a basement and then a main floor that had a large back porch and a wraparound front porch, and in between was the kitchen, and then next to the kitchen was the dining room, and next to the dining room was a living room, and next to the living room was a parlor, and the little ante room for the front porch. And the phone was attached to the wall in this room. And the phone was a box on the wall with a mouthpiece, and the earpiece was separate and bell-shaped and hung on a claw-shaped hanger. In those days, only one person in a neighborhood would have a phone, and the other people would come and make phone calls if an emergency to that house. Then we go back to the kitchen and go same direction as the dining room, and there was a little office which later became Grandma's bedroom. And in between were stairs going upstairs, which had a landing halfway up. And upstairs there was 5 bathrooms and 1 room that was used that had a claw bathtub. In those days they didn't have running water and electricity. They had wells and outhouses. At that time, Grandma and Grandpa Strive had cold running water. They had a wood stove in the kitchen and a wood heating stove in the dining room that heated the rest of the house. And the well was out by the barn, but I want to get back to the house. Grandma Strive, everybody's birthday, anniversary, and holiday was an excuse for the family to get together for a party. And there was no drinking or smoking in Grandma's house. And we did not, at that time, the ladies wore dresses and the girls wore dresses. And the men didn't swear in front of the ladies, and the ladies didn't swear. When we had our parties, we would play games with the whole family, and we'd go in the parlor and we'd rearrange the chairs and play musical chairs, or we'd open the parlor doors and play upset the fruit basket. And this was a game where one person gave each person in the room the name of a fruit, and when they ran out of fruit they went to vegetables. And then, like Cherry would trade chairs with the pear, and they'd do that for a while, and then they'd say upset the fruit basket, and you'd have to run across the room, and the last person to get a chair was it for the next game. Our games were always noisy and rowdy, and Grandma never cared. She said to me one time, when everybody's talking at the same time, they're having a good time. Then from there, Grandma and Grandpa got too old to run the farm, so Uncle Pete, Grandpa gave Three of his sons an acre each. One was at the road entrance on Shattuck Road, right by Grandpa's house. And one was on Vermont Street, straight down south of that. And then there were two houses east on the other end of the property. One was Aunt Minnie's and the other one was Uncle Fred's, and they each had an acre of property. And they farmed the farm together. One Easter, Grandma boiled a copper laundry tub, 12 dozen eggs, and then Mama and she colored them and they made Easter baskets, and they put them out. Grandpa hid them in the barn for us kids to find. Well, I was 4 and my little girl cousin was 2, and the other cousins were boys and they were older. And so they were finding baskets like crazy, and Grandpa'd try to show us little girls where a basket was, and the boys would hurry up and take it. So the girls got back to the house without any Easter baskets. Well, my little cousin Louise cried because she didn't have a basket. So they made her another basket, but they didn't have any more baskets, and I didn't get one. And my aunt remarked to my mother, I didn't get a basket, and my mother said, oh, she doesn't need one, I'm going to make her one at home. So I didn't get one with the rest of the kids, but that was okay. And then we played another game we played was we'd get into Grandma's sewing box and get a button, and we'd hide the button in our hand behind our back, and one person would be it, and they'd move the button back and forth, and then they'd put their hand out in a fist and they'd say, button, button, who's got the button? And you had to guess correctly which hand it was in order to move up the stairs. We did it on the stairway. And the first one to get to the landing was the winner, and they got to hold the button next time. We had to create our own toys. When I was 4, we moved down into Uncle Pete's house, and Uncle Pete moved up into Grandpa's house and run the farm. And Grandpa moved down into Uncle Henry's house, which was on Vermont Street. And I started school at the age of 5. I had to go take a test because you were supposed to be 6. And school started in September and I was 6 in January. So I passed the test and got to start. Well, I started in a 2-room schoolhouse called Fairvale, and it was a mile from Grandpa's house. Grandpa was on the south side of Shattuck Road, and the school was on the north side of Shattuck Road. And we had 4 grades in a room, and there were fewer children in those 4 grades than there are in one class now. I believe there were 6 children in 1st grade. And 2 memorable events when I went to that school. First, at Christmas, they asked us to bring a small gift that could be tied on a Christmas tree. One of the local loggers donated a very beautiful, full, tall Christmas tree. And then the PTA and the teachers each brought a small gift to be hung on the Christmas tree. Well, when we came to school, the last day before Christmas vacation, here was this big spider web from the tree to our desks. And we were told not to break it because somebody wouldn't get their present if we did. And I'll never forget what that spider web of string looked like. Then the second thing, a logger donated a pole. He picked out a tree and limbed it, so we had a pole, and at the small end of the pole, I think it must have been, I always thought it was 10 feet tall, but it was probably around 8. And teachers tied blue and pink ribbons, or they fastened blue and pink ribbons to the small end of the pole alternately. Then the ribbons came down to the ground, and the girls got the pink ribbons and the boys got the blue ribbons, and we faced each other. And then we walked around the tree in a circle, the pole in a circle, and when we got through and they turned the music off, we looked back up, and here was this beautiful braided top from the ribbon being interwoven by our walking around. And even the boys thought it was pretty. Then when I turned 5, as I say, let's see. Then when I was in 3rd grade, we were in Uncle Pete's little house, and we had a real bad snowstorm one year. In one night, it snowed 3 feet with 10-foot drifts. So we finally had to wait till they got the drifts cleared to where we could go through the snow. And I had a picture of my mother pulling me on a sled to school. And the interesting thing about this was she had put my daddy's pants on and his shirt and jacket in order to be warm enough to take me to school, and this was a very daring thing for her to do at that time. And when I turned 7, we were still living there. My mother had bleeding ulcers, and she had a bad session which ended in the hospital. Our times were hard, and when she came home, we couldn't afford someone to take care of her. And we had a wood stove and cold running water, and I cooked the meals, and Mama would tell me what to do. And I could barely reach the top of the stove, so they wouldn't let me fry meat, but I could put vegetables on to boil, or if it was an oven meal, I could make the whole meal. Then after dinner, I would be the one to do the dishes. Well, I had to stand on a chair in order to reach the sink, and 3 nights in a row, I broke one dish. Well, Mama wasn't feeling well, and I got reamed up one side and down the other, and believe me, I never broke another dish. Then Grandpa gave us an acre of property down on Vermont Street, about 5 blocks east of where Uncle Henry's house was. And we built a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house that had a kitchen, dining room, and living room, and a basement, and an unfinished upstairs, and 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. They gave us a housewarming, and this one friend of Mother's danced. They had an accordion player there, and they danced, and the ladies brought food for potluck. And the one gentleman friend of Mother's turned me around in so many circles when we danced. I got not feeling well and had to go up to bed. Down in the basement, we had a wood furnace. And we'd buy the wood by a cord, and Dad would have me throw the wood in through the basement window and stack it in a neat stack. And then we had a wood lift that came up to the kitchen so that the chopped wood would feed the stove. Well, Mother wanted hot running water, so she had a boiler, 10-gallon water heater, and she had him run the pipes in the firebox of the stove. And when we heard the water gurgling in the hot water tank, we had to turn it on so it wouldn't explode. And we had one of the first washing machines, which was a round tub, and it had an arm on top with bell-shaped, little bell-shaped things on the end, and it went up and down, and these bell-shaped things pounded the clothes, and I guess they pounded the dirt out. But they didn't have all the automatic stuff we have now. We had a hand wringer we would attach to the side of the washing machine, and then we'd hand crank the clothes through this wringer into a laundry tray. Then we'd move the wringer over to the next laundry tray and hand crank again, and then we'd hand crank it out to be hung on the line to dry. And we ironed clothes in those days, like sheets and tablecloths, which we don't do now. And we had an ice box downstairs, and it was Depression times, and he would come in up the back porch and he'd say, 25-cent or 50-cent piece today. And we would tell him which one we could afford that day. And they put the ice in the ice box, and that's where we kept our milk, which was sold in a bottle and delivered to the house. And we had to clean the bottle so it could go back to the farmer to be refilled. While at this house, they closed Fairvale School, and we were bused to Multnomah School, which had a pontoon system. In the pontoon system, you had 4 subjects in homeroom: reading, writing, arithmetic, and history or geography, whatever the subject was the teacher decided to do that day. And then we walked by twos down the hall to the art teacher, which taught us different modes of art, whether it was painting or drawing or doing construction paper cutouts. And then we also had nature study, which was our teacher from one of the teachers from Fairvale. And Mrs. Hawes went down, I think, to Southern California, where the monarch butterflies breed, and brought home a twig with a chrysalis on it. And she put it up in the top shelf of a little closet they had for supplies, paper and stuff. And our class happened to be in there when that butterfly hatched, and it was the largest, most beautiful butterfly I ever saw, with brilliant orange and black wings. Another thing this teacher did, one day we came to school, to class, and she had 3 stones sitting on the desk, and she wanted us to tell her what kind of stones these were. And we told, one boy knew, but so was told not to tell. Well, we finally figured out they were candy. And the local Van Dyne's candy store had just started making these particular chocolates in the form of a stone, and they looked just like a pebble you might see in a creek. Then we also would go to library. Library, we learned how to file books on the library shelves. We also could do reading and studying in there. And then we had auditorium. And auditorium would be similar to drama now. We learned about the classic composers of music, and we had to memorize poems, and we put on sketches. Then besides that, we had gym. And gym was different in those days, I believe, than now. We had a set like the Olympic Games. We had what we called dumbbells, but they were barbells, and Indian clubs that we did exercises with. We had one wall that had wooden ladders, I'll call them. They were dowels about 3 feet wide that went up from floor to ceiling and fixed like a ladder that we climbed, or we would use them to do stretch exercises. Then we had relay races, we jumped hurdles, we played softball, and after school when we played softball, we didn't have t-ball and all that. And if we didn't have enough for 2 teams, we played workup. And in workup, when the batter would strike out, the pitcher would become the catcher, and the catcher would become the batter. Outfield would get into short field, and then we'd go from third, second to first base to pitcher. That way everybody played a position, and we got to play, and we just played in the field or the road by where we lived. Then we played basketball. However, our softball and basketball games were just to learn the game. We didn't have inter-school contests. And in basketball, I was the center, and I was a head shorter than the other girl, but I was a good jumper, and I could get the ball away from her and get it to our team. And it was a good time, and we had a rounded education. In 7th and 8th grade, the boys had manual training. They learned to bake bird nests, cedar chests, cocktail tables, and things like that. And we had home economics, and we learned to cook and to sew. And as I said, we had to iron, learn the proper way to iron the linen, napkins, and tablecloths and our sheets, and the proper way to fold them, and the proper way to fold clothes. And we learned to make homemade bread and potato salad and just anything you would need to eat. Then for graduation, because we were in the Depression and some of the girls' daddies were out of work, they didn't want the working girl Daddy's girls to be dressed better than the others, so we made our own dresses in sewing class, and we had to buy cotton material, and they had 3 different patterns we could choose from. And then came high school, but we were a suburb of Portland, and at that time Portland only had one high school on the west side of the Willamette River. And the children from our suburbs, clear out in our neck of the woods, and Dunthorpe, and just any suburb like that from Lake Oswego, came to Lincoln High School. And we also had the very poorest people in town that were, well, excuse the expression, from the whorehouses, and just very poor circumstances that came to our school. And we were taught to treat each other as equals. And that was a good lesson. And the other good lesson I had in high school was I had a civics teacher who taught us that when you, in those days we just had radios for communication besides newspapers. And when you read an article in the newspaper or hear it on the radio, it's that person's opinion. You get the facts and make up your own mind about what you're hearing. And that held me in good stead all through my life. And the other thing I did in grammar school and high school is my mother's father was Swiss, and they had PSTV, was Portland's Social Turnverein, which was a Swiss organization where the Swiss could go and socialize, and they had a gym and a swimming pool. And I went to this gym and had athletic classes there all through school. And I was fortunate to be able to have that. Excuse me, I'm going back. In grammar school, in 8th grade gym, the Rose Festival was started with a collection of all the schools. No, I guess that was high school. All the schools had a representation of the gym class, and we all did the same exercise with Indian clubs. Well, I was picked out to be my picture taken, and I was in the newsreel in the movie and didn't even know it, and other people told us about it. In those days, the movies had huge reels that were larger than a dinner plate, and the movie went one way, then they would have vaudeville while they rewrapped it. And they'd have a movie and a newsreel and a cartoon. And on the vaudeville, I got to see Abbott and Costello. And I'll never forget the story, one story they told. Bud Abbott said to Luce Costello, "You're sure dumb." And he said, "I'm not either." And he said, "You are too." And he said, "You're so dumb you can't make a sentence with Mississippi in it." And he said, "Yes, I can." He said, "Well, let me hear you." And he said, I know a man who eats peas with his knife and he never misses a pea. That really hit my funny bone. I'd like to tell you about the telephone system. Grandpa's box I told you about. Well, then from there, they had a telephone that stood up on a rod with a speaker, and then the separate ear part. And you picked it up, and the operator would ask for your number, and the numbers had like Broadway and Walnut and 234 or whatever. Then from there they went to a dial phone. And from the dial phone they went to a punch phone. And well, the dial phone and punch phones were on party lines. And then we finally got private lines. That was a big deal. And then nowadays, you've got the telephone that's an extension of your hand. And the movies, I was 5 when I went to my first movie that I remember. And they had the vaudeville, I remember. The lady was on the balcony with great big long hair which came down to the floor, and there were ballerinas dressed like tulips, and they were closed so they looked like tulips. And the guy came out and was singing Tiptoe Through the Tulips. And then the tulip girls brought their arms down so that the tulips opened up. And I said to my mama, how did those girls get their heads in those flowers? And everybody in the show broke up. And the show we went to, I think, was called Ramona. Anyhow, the shows were black and white with printing at the bottom that you read what they said. Then this show was the first one to have Technicolor and voice. And they sang the Indian Love Call. And I keep thinking it must have been Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy, but it seems like it's too early. But then that's who keeps coming back to my mind. And then when I was preteen, I'd walk from where we lived in Maplewood on Vermont Street over to Multnomah to the theater. And for 10 cents, I could go to the matinee. And we did that. And they had in those days, it was all talking pictures and a good variety of productions, mostly cowboys and Indians, but they had some singing ones and whatnot. And when I went to high school, I had to, high school, we had to furnish our own transportation from our home to high school. And the high school was on the west side of Portland, and my dad worked on the east side of Portland. And I would walk from the park blocks where the school was, 9th Street, down across the Hawthorne Bridge over to Grand Avenue in Portland, and then down Grand to where my dad's work was to go home. And never thought anything of it. It was just something I had to do. Then my first job after I got out of high school, our graduating class in high school, we were still kind of in hard times, and we voted to wear caps and gowns. There were 200 in our class, and it was the first class in Portland, Oregon to graduate with cap and gown. Then my first job after I got out of high school was babysitting a 13-month-old girl while her mother had surgery in the hospital and the daddy had to work. I cooked 3 meals a day, cleaned the house, did the washing and the ironing, took care of the little girl. I got my room and board and $5 a month and was well paid. Then my next job that I had, I went to Montgomery Ward, and my cousin was trying to get me on in the restaurant with her. Instead of that, I ended up in the section where they made the labels that they put on the packages they mailed out. And we had to do so many every 20 minutes, and we had a supervisor looking over us. I never was one who could work with somebody looking over my shoulder. Well, I ended up getting fired from that job. Then I went to Fred Meyer, which was a new store then, and got a job as a clerk and explained that I could work if I was told what to do and left alone. And so it worked out okay. But the highest pay I could work up to there was $21 a week. And the little cafe around the corner where I ate, the lady said she'd pay me $25 a week. So I quit working at Fred Meyer's and went to work as the cook and chief cook and bottle washer, I guess you call them, in this little cafe. And then from there, I went to, when I was 18, I went to Jantzen Beach. And Jantzen Beach was a carnival type thing at that time, where they had rides and eating places, and they had a ballroom. And I was old enough to work at the milk bar that they called the milk bar because no alcohol was served. Well, I started out in a little cart that sold peanuts and popcorn and cotton candy, and that's all that was there. And I made more one day. I made $75 for them, and that was more than they made at a Midway stand, and so I got put in the Midway stand. And then from there, this was mostly summer type job. World War II broke out while I was working there, and I went to work at the Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington. And we'd go across the bridge. Well, they built the new bridge going north, and we had to pay toll. But the toll in that days was 10 cents one way, or a token which was good for 3 trips, and it was only a quarter. You got 3 for a quarter. And so I was working in the office where the ship's damaged material would be reordered by us. So my boss said to me one day, well, you could probably get engineers' pay instead of clerks' pay, which is a little more, but you might get fired too. And so I went up to see if I could get into the engineers' union, and for my job, and so my boss was supposed to be up there talking to him why I should have it and the other girls not. And so they came down to the office and he wasn't there. And fortunately, while they were there, the phone rang and this fellow wanted to know about a part we had reordered. So I told him I had to wait. I had to get the blueprint, and I got the blueprint and the paperwork for the order and explained that the one screw was being made in our machine shop, and he said, well, that was the part he was worried about. And then after I hung up from that, they said, well, that said I could belong to their union. So they said, you're going to get a raise. I got a whole nickel raise. But a nickel was a nickel. When the war was over, well, while I was working at Johnson Beach, one of the girlfriends there introduced me to my future husband, Lynn Hazen, but I didn't know he was going to be my husband then. And when I left Johnson, the Kaiser shipyard, I went to work for the White Motor Truck Company in Portland in the office. And then when my husband came home from overseas, we got married. And I quit my job, and we were married in the church, and we didn't stay to be with our guests. We left right away because we went up to Vancouver, BC on a honeymoon, and we had to be there by 5 o'clock or else lose our room. And so that was the first time I'd been out of the United States. So that, in fact, furthest away I'd been from home between Portland and Seattle. And then when we came home from Portland, from the honeymoon, we were stationed at Boeing Field in Seattle, and that was an eye-opener because it was the end of the war, and when we drove up to the South Park to the housing where we were going to live, here were a whole city built on top of Boeing Field. They had houses, camouflage net with houses, trees, roads, street lights, everything on it. And so we lived in government housing there, low-income housing. And we closed that base out and went to McCord Field. At McCord Field, we lived at Spanaway, Washington at first. Well, while we were, let's see, while we were at Spanaway, we had our baby daughter, Marilyn. And we had an oil stove for a cooking stove there. And from there, I got pregnant again while we bought a home in Parkland, Washington. And these were all while he was stationed at McCord. And we had a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house with a living room with an oil heater and a kitchen with an eating area in it and a separate garage and a 1/4 acre, and it was $5,500. That, while we were there in 1949, I was pregnant with my son, And when my daughter would lay down for a nap, I'd take a nap. And I woke up to this roar. And I thought, oh, the oil stove's going to explode. And I ran over and turned it off. And then I looked down the hall, and the hall was going, the floor was going up and down, and the walls were going back and forth. And I thought, oh, an earthquake. And our daughter called, and I said, I'm coming. Well, then we didn't know any better, and we all ran outside. And it was a 7.4 earthquake, and the center was at Puyallup. And that was the strongest earthquake I was ever in. And about 6 months later, Portland had an earthquake that was 6.9. And my mother, we had given my mother a large mirror to hang over the fireplace. And she stood in front of that mirror because she didn't want it to break, and she wanted to catch it. And her face came and went with the mirror moving. And she got so sick she had to go outside and sit on the porch. Try to catch the mirror, it would have cut her. Yeah. So, and anyhow, then my husband put in for Europe because he wanted me to meet the people who befriended him in London during World War II. Well, we ended up in Tripoli, Libya, in North Africa. And that was a real eye-opener. We had one of the 9 best apartments. We had cold running water, period, a 2-burner gas plate for a stove, and the only reason we had a refrigerator is we bought the refrigerator from the people who'd been there before. And my sink was marble, and the drain board was about 3 feet long, and the cold running water and the 2-burner gas plate sat on the drain board. And the floor was granite, I'm sorry, a granite tile. And if I dropped a dish, all I had to do is get the dustpan and broom and sweep it up. But it had a kitchen, a bathroom, a dining area, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 bedrooms. So we used 1 bedroom for a living room, and had it must have had 5 bedrooms, because we had a bedroom for each child, and a bedroom for ourselves, and the living room. And then we had a maid, and there was room for the maid, too. And we had a little storage closet. That was the only time shortly after I got there, I was driving out to the base, which was about a mile or so. There was a Arabic village called Suklajuma in between that Tripoli and the base, and I was past a truck, and shouldn't have, I guess, because I didn't realize at the time so many of the people had sight problems. And the cop stopped me. And he said, follow me, but I didn't understand that at that time, and I went as fast as I could to the base. And he came out at the base hunting me, but he didn't get me. And that was pretty scary in another country, you know. And they had I can't think what it's called now, a goat. A desert goat in a enclosed area for the people to see. The houses were built, okay, the first floor was the businesses, and the second floor was apartments, and we were on the third floor. And we walked up. There was no elevators. And the walls were a foot thick, and they had a window with a shutter on the outside and a shutter on the inside. And they would have dust storms called gibblies. And when they would get those, that dust would work its way clear through all that shutter business. But Mussolini, we learned a different opinion of him. We thought he was a terrible man. The Italians thought he was wonderful. He was going to make that area his Garden of Eden. Italy was overpopulated, and he paid their passage from Italy to Tripoli, and out on the desert he had planted trees. And he built a house, had it completely furnished with linens, food, furniture, everything they would need to start living. And they got, I think it was 5 acres, and had to work it 10 years, and then it was theirs. I might have it backwards. Then they said Mussolini was good, but it was his fascist leaders who weren't any good. And of course that was a different opinion than what we were used to. The business was conducted in Italian, and the Jews had most of the businesses, and there were some Arab businesses too. And the kids, my daughter started school on base, and I went to activities on base. They had it was under English rule at that time, and I could, from our apartment, I could see the English troops training in the field down below. And there were, directly below us was the French embassy, and it had beautiful gardens. But we became acquainted with the English, and we went to their clubs. In our club, you had to be very quiet and not make a lot of noise, but the English would put a beer can under each arm, one in each hand, and one between their legs, and then they'd have a race across the floor to see who could get across the floor first. And they taught us how to do the Lambeth Walk while we were there. Is that where you put your little foot in, and put your right hand in, put your right hand out, and do the hokey pokey? That's the one they taught us. Well, they did the hokey pokey by slapping their knees, clapping their hands, and then putting them up. And later, when we were having reunions, and I danced the hokey pokey on board ship, a riverboat, with everybody, and I was doing the hokey pokey like they taught us, and I looked around, and here everybody was shaking their hands up in the air. So I had to change what I was doing. And I used to say I spoke English, and now I say I speak American, because like aluminum was aluminum, and an elevator was a lift, a baby buggy was a pram, and the English was altogether different than what our language was. And we were over there 2 years, and then we came back to the States. And we were stationed at McCord. My husband would sign up for 4 years at a time. That way we'd be assured of getting home to see the family. Then from there we were stationed at Norton Air Force Base at San Bernardino, California. When we first went down, we couldn't find housing there, and we lived in Fontana for a year. Well, my folks came down for a visit at Christmas time, and we went down, crossed the border in Mexico, and I don't remember the name of the Tijuana. And then we came on, we stopped at the San Diego Zoo, and they had peacocks running wild at that time. And I understand they're not there now. And we stopped at Knott's Berry Farm. And at Knott's Berry Farm, they had these Westerners hired to rob the bank. And then when we went for a little train ride in the berry farm, they came on board to act like they were going to steal the purses, and they act like they were going to take my mother's purse, and my son said, "You leave my grandma alone," and he kicked him in the shins. And it was real to him. We came on home, and then another time with the PTA, while we lived in Fontana, I got to go. There was a TV program called Queen for a Day, and I got to go watch the taping of Queen for a Day, which was an interesting experience. In those days, they'd hold up a card to tell you whether to clap or laugh or whatever. And nowadays, I understand they just turn a light on, and you're supposed to, when that light's on, you're supposed to clap. Then we moved to San Bernardino, and while we were there, we were put in for Alaska. We wanted to go up to Anchorage, to Elmendorf Air Force Base. Well, when we went up there, we drove the Alcan Highway, and it was still a highway that followed an elk trail up. And so it was pretty windy. And at that time, Alaska was a territory. And on the way up, I'd always heard how much wild game there was in British Columbia. Well, we drove clear through British Columbia and didn't see any. Then we got into the Yukon Territory, and there was a moose in the road. And I says, "Oh, there's a moose." And then we went a little further, and there was another moose in the road. And I said, "Oh, there's a moose." And my husband turned to me and he said, "You don't need to get so excited. You can say, 'There's a moose.'" So we went and we crossed over from the Yukon Territory into Alaska, and there was a huge mama bear and some yearlings browsing on the hillside. And I said, "There are 3 bears on the hillside." He looked. He pulled the car over to the curb and stopped, run around to the back trunk and got his gun out and looked through the scope and come back in. And he was just shaking, and he said, "That's the biggest bear I've ever seen." And I said, "Oh, it makes a difference who gets excited." I never did let him forget that. And then we drove on down to Anchorage from there. And Fort Richardson and Elmendorf Air Force Base were in the game preserve. And the one moose I saw, I swear the antlers were 6 feet across. They were the hugest rack I ever did see. And in Anchorage, we lived off base for a year, and then we got on base, and I started at Mountain View where we lived, working for Sears Roebuck, and in the catalog order department. I answered the phone, and I would take orders over the phone, and I got compliments from the people I ordered from what good service they got, because they got everything they wanted. And from there I went out to the work in the front desk. And then we got on base. Well, they told us that we could, when we first went up, they told us we could get all kinds of furniture from the base for off-base housing. We got up there and they didn't have any, and we had a packing crate for a table, and we slept in GI cots, and I don't know what we sat on, boxes, I guess, camp stools or something. Anyhow, eventually we got furniture. That we weren't supposed. Well, what first thing that surprised me about living on base, I thought they'd have garages for cars, but no. They had this big line of electrical outlets, and you had to have a headbolt heater in the radiator of the car, and you just plugged the car in every night. And that kept your car from freezing. Then it was a condo type complex with basements, a kitchen, dining room, living room downstairs, and we had 3 bedrooms and a bath upstairs. And the kids went to school there. Let's see, the northern lights were real pretty. They would go from red and greens and everything in the sky. And we weren't supposed to put water on the ground in the winter, but everybody did anyhow, so the kids could ice skate. And then they'd ice skate in the backyard. The first year I didn't drive because it started snowing in September, and then it would leave in March or April. And I had never driven on snow, and I was afraid to, but after that I decided I better get in and learn, or I wouldn't be able to go any place or do anything. And we'd go from Anchorage to Portage, which was south, and do hooligan fishing, which is the same as smelting in this area. And one gentleman was very drunk and being a very bad pest, and he fell in the river, and everybody laughed at him, and nobody offered to help him out. And he was swearing. He said, "You better help me out, I can't swim." Well, finally one guy stuck his net handle down, helped him out, and then he left, and that was good. Well, we had a neighbor and his son with us, and his son was 2 years old, and we were going home, and he said, "Dio, there's a baby moose, we better take him home, we need him." But this same people had a lion for a pet in their garage, and we went over to see the lion, and I was standing up by its head, and it turned its head over and put its mouth on my ankle, and I never moved. And pretty soon the owner had him let go. He let go, and I stepped back further. Oh, and also while we were in Anchorage, the Bob Hope show came up. And Ginger Rogers was one of the acts, and she was the most beautiful woman I ever saw. And I felt lucky to have gotten to see the show. And my husband's hangar was the one they decided to show it in, and they put up seats and whatnot. And then let's see what else happened. Oh, they got statehood, and cordwood from each one of the 48 southern states was sent up to Anchorage, and they had a big bonfire. And it was the 4th of July, of course, and you couldn't shoot fireworks in downtown Anchorage, but tell you fireworks were going off everywhere in downtown Anchorage. Also, my husband's an avid hunter, and he went up to Whitey Fassler's to hunt. And Whitey told of one time he was out hunting, and this mother elk charged him, and he climbed a tree, and after he got up in the tree, he saw he still had his snowshoes on. And then another place we went for my husband to go hunting was up to the Al Lee's guide service. When my husband was in the Three Seas in 1938, he went up to Mount McKinley with the Three Seas, and they did the yard decorating or cleaning or creating, whatever you want to call it, around the Mount McKinley Hotel. And I wanted to go up, but we never did get up to see that. We got down to Homer, and on the way to Homer is the Russian River, and we got Lynn's dad up for a visit, and we took him down there fishing. And I understand now, at that time we could get a 3 fish limit to what we could have for salmon. I don't know if they can get that many now. But everybody went back to the truck but my daughter and I, and my daughter caught a great big fish after they left, and we came back with the big salmon that she caught. Now, at that same place, they have a whistle they blow that people have to leave when they blow it because the bears are coming down to the river. We didn't have that problem when we were there, but it's more settled, so I can see where they would. We went back down the Alcan Highway from Anchorage to Moses Lake, Washington, and we're stationed there for a while. And then my husband went, I had major surgery, and my husband went to Plattsburgh Air Force Base in New York, and I went down to my parents. He didn't want me traveling that far. I came home from the hospital on Tuesday, and he came home Thursday that he was transferred. So we were separated for a year, and then he was out of the service. And you kids know most of the history after that. So, Dwayne, I'm sorry you live so far away, but I hope you get this okay. And Marilyn, I appreciate all you do, and hope you enjoy this part of my life. And I wish you both well, happiness, and good choices in life.